My son and his wife locked my wife and me inside the basement of our own home, believing an old man like me had nothing left to fight for. My wife trembled in the darkness and whispered, "What are we going to do?" I looked at the cracked wall in front of us and quietly said, "Stay calm. They have no idea what's hidden behind those bricks." Locked in that darkness with my trembling wife, I removed a single stone from the wall, hiding a secret kept untouched for 43 years. What I found behind it changed everything I thought I knew about my life. Thank you so much for being here with me today on Revenge Dad. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. A quick note, this story contains some fictional elements woven in for entertainment and reflection. Any similarity to actual names or places is coincidental, but the lesson it carries is one I hope stays with you. My name is Walter Bennett, and I am 70 years old. I have lived long enough to know that some mornings lie to you. This particular Saturday morning in September 2024 looked honest enough. The sun came up over the San Gabriel Mountains the way it always does in Pasadena, slow and golden, filtering through the old oak trees that line Marengo Avenue like patient sentinels. The light landed on the red brick face of my house the same way it had landed there for the past 22 years, turning the mortar between the bricks a warm amber color that made the whole structure look like something out of a painting. Mockingbirds were doing their usual business in the jacaranda tree near the front gate. A neighbor 3 doors down was walking her golden retriever, waving at nobody in particular. Everything looked like peace. I was sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hands, and I was thinking about Thomas Hale. Thomas had been a quiet man. He was the kind of man who measured his words the way an accountant measures figures, carefully with purpose, never wasting a single one. He had raised me in a small house in the Altadena Hills north of here, and his idea of expressing affection was making sure my school lunch had exactly the right amount of everything, and that my shoes were always resoled before they wore through. He never told me he loved me, but he checked my homework every night for 12 years, and when I graduated from Cal Poly with my engineering degree, I saw him press his lips together in that tight way he had, and I understood that was as close to tears as Thomas Hale ever allowed himself to get. He passed away in the spring of 2010 in a hospital bed at Huntington Memorial with his hand in mine. His voice had dropped to almost nothing by then, but he squeezed my fingers with a grip that surprised me for a man so diminished, and he said, "Don't ever sell this house, Walter. If someone comes wanting it at any price, you open the wall in the basement." I told him I would. I meant it as a kindness to a dying man. I did not truly understand what he was asking of me. That was 14 years ago. I had kept the promise without understanding it the way you keep certain habits long after you have forgotten why you started them. I blew across the cold surface of my coffee and thought about the phone call I needed to make. The screen door behind me pushed open, and Evelyn stepped out onto the porch in her blue robe, carrying her own mug and wearing the expression she reserved for mornings, when she suspected I had been sitting outside too long, with too many thoughts. She was 67 years old, and still the most clear-eyed person I had ever known. She sat down in the chair beside mine, tucked her feet up under her, and looked out at Marengo Avenue with the comfortable confidence of a woman who had made peace with the neighborhood decades ago. "You were up before the birds again," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She turned to look at me with those sharp brown eyes, the ones that had never once let me get away with a partial truth. "Is it Brandon?" I wrapped both hands around my cold mug and stared at the oak trees. Brandon Cole was Evelyn's son from before we met. He had kept his father's surname, Cole, the name of a man who left when Brandon was 4 years old and never looked back. When I came into his life at 9, I did not ask him to change it. A name is not a leash. He was my son in every way that counted, and I was his father, and neither of us needed paperwork to confirm what we already knew. A boy of 9 years old when I first came into his life, scrawny and watchful and desperate for someone to stay. I had stayed. I had driven him to Little League practice and helped him with his algebra homework and taught him to drive in the parking lot of Pasadena City College on a Sunday morning, both of us laughing when he nearly took out a shopping cart. I had written the check for his UCLA tuition without a second thought. And when he graduated and told me in front of a restaurant full of people that I was the only father he had ever really had, my chest had felt so full I thought something might crack. "He called yesterday evening," I said, "after you went to bed." Evelyn set her mug down on the armrest with a small, careful click. How bad is it? The real estate company is underwater. He borrowed against properties that haven't moved, and the loans are coming due. I paused, choosing the next words precisely. He said there's a fund willing to step in, bail out the debt, give him breathing room. That sounds like good news. But the way she said it told me she was reading my face and not liking what she found there. The fund is called Crown Meridian. Evelyn went very still. She knew that name. She had sat beside me through the worst of 2008, had watched me come home from depositions, gray-faced and hollow, had held my hand. When the Board of Bennett Infrastructure voted to suspend me pending investigation, she had been in the courtroom hallway the morning the judge dismissed the charges for insufficient evidence, not innocent, just unproven, and she had seen what that distinction did to a man's eyes. Walter? Her voice came out rough at the edges. The same Crown Meridian that took your company, the very same. I finally took a sip of the cold coffee more for something to do with my hands than because I wanted it. Brandon says they have new management, new direction. He thinks I'm holding on to an old grudge. Evelyn made a sound in her throat that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. She pressed her fingers hard against her lips for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, but only just. What did you tell him? I told him to stay away from them. He told me I was letting the past block his only lifeline. I set the mug down on the porch railing, and then we said goodbye and hung up, and I sat here all night thinking about what Thomas said about the basement wall. The mockingbirds had moved on to a different tree. Down the block, the woman with the golden retriever had disappeared around the corner. Marengo Avenue looked exactly the same as it always had, quiet, sun-warmed, ordinary. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I had not touched in years. Samuel Grant, attorney at law. Old Pasadena office. The man who had fought beside me through the entire Bennett infrastructure disaster, and lost, not because he lacked skill, but because the evidence against me had been constructed with a perfection that no honest fraud ever achieves. Samuel had said it himself the morning the case collapsed. Walter, real criminals make mistakes. Whoever did this to you didn't make a single one. That's not bad luck. That's engineering. I had thought about those words more times than I could count in the years since. My thumb hovered over Samuel's number. My heart was beating faster than the quiet morning, deserved a low, urgent drumming behind my ribs that I recognized from the worst days of 2008, the body's way of saying that something was already in motion, whether the mind was ready or not. I pressed call. The phone rang twice. Then Samuel Grant's voice, rougher with age, but still carrying that particular quality of a man who read every word before he spoke it. Walter, it's been a while. It has, I said. Samuel, I need to come in, today if possible. A beat of quiet. Then, how serious? I looked at the red brick face of my house, at the oak trees, at the ordinary golden morning that had been lying to me since before I woke up. I think it's starting again, I said. Samuel Grant's office on Colorado Boulevard had not changed in 15 years. The same wooden sign hung above the door, the letters slightly faded but still readable. The same stack of legal journals occupied the corner of the waiting room. The same framed photograph of the California Supreme Court building hung slightly crooked on the wall behind the receptionist's desk. And I had the irrational thought that if I straightened it, the whole careful illusion of normalcy might collapse. Samuel himself met me at the door. He was 65 now, with steel gray hair cut close to his head and the kind of posture that came not from vanity, but from decades of standing in courtrooms where slouching cost you credibility. He shook my hand with both of his, a habit he had when the situation was serious, and led me back to his office without small talk. Sit down, Walter. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. I pulled everything I could find on Brandon Cole's company after you called. I want you to look at something before I tell you what it means. He slid a manila folder across the desk. I opened it, and my chest tightened the moment I saw the address at the top of the first page. 1412 Marengo Avenue, Pasadena, California. My address, my house. Listed as primary collateral in a loan application submitted 6 weeks ago by Brandon Cole, sole proprietor of Cole Property Group, LLC, in the amount of $3,200,000. My hands did not shake. I had learned long ago to keep my hands still when everything else was falling apart. But something behind my sternum contracted so sharply it nearly took my breath away, a physical sensation, like a fist closing around my heart. He used my house, I said. The words came out flat and quiet, which was the only way I trusted myself to say them. Without your signature, without your knowledge, without any recorded authorization. Samuel leaned forward with his elbows on the desk. What Brandon submitted describes the property as an asset in the process of being transferred to his company. He didn't say you had already signed anything. He implied it was coming. Under federal law, using someone else's property as collateral without authorization is mortgage fraud. That's Title 18 United States Code, Section 1014. It carries up to 30 years in federal prison. I closed the folder, opened it again, closed it. "There's more," Samuel said, and his voice carried the careful tone of a man delivering a second blow to someone already staggered by the first. Crown Meridian extended Brandon an emergency line of credit 3 weeks ago. The terms are specific. He has to deliver documented control of your property, meaning a signed deed or a notarized transfer agreement before 8 o'clock Monday morning. If he fails to deliver, Crown Meridian has the contractual right to freeze every account associated with Cole Property Group and pursue all listed assets for recovery. "Monday morning," I repeated. "That's the day after tomorrow." "Yes." I stood up from the chair because sitting felt suddenly impossible. I walked to the window and looked out at Colorado Boulevard, the Saturday morning foot traffic. A woman pushing a stroller, 2 college kids on bicycles, a man eating a breakfast burrito on a bench outside the coffee shop across the street. Everything ordinary. Everything utterly indifferent to the fact that my life was being disassembled at a document level by the same organization that had done it to me once before. "He's coming Sunday," I said. "He called last night to confirm. He's bringing Melissa." "Walter." Samuel's chair scraped back, and he came to stand beside me at the window. "I can file an emergency motion today. We can have a temporary restraining order on any property transfer by this afternoon. We can call the FBI field office. Crown Meridian is not a new name to federal investigators, I promise you that." I turned to look at him. "Not yet." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Walter, Evelyn doesn't know." My voice cracked on the last word just slightly, and I pressed my back teeth together hard until it steadied. "If I call the FBI today, Brandon gets arrested before Evelyn has any idea what her son has been doing. She'll find out about all of it at once from strangers in the worst possible way." I looked back at the window. I need one day Samuel. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with before I blow her world apart. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, not the quiet of hesitation, but the quiet of a man recalculating. Then he nodded once slowly. "One day, but Walter, if anything goes wrong Sunday, I'll call you the moment it does." I picked up the folder from his desk and held it in both hands. "I need to know one more thing. Is there any scenario in which what Crown Meridian is doing here is legal?" Samuel shook his head with the certainty of a man who had spent 40 years reading contracts. "None. They know Brandon doesn't own that property. They know he can't authorize a transfer, which means they're not planning to acquire the house through legitimate channels." He paused. "They're planning to acquire it through Brandon, which is a very different thing." I thought about Thomas's voice in the hospital room. Open the wall in the basement. I thought about the way Crown Meridian had dismantled Bennett infrastructure, the forged electronic signatures. The phantom wire transfers, the chief financial officer standing before the board, with documents so perfectly constructed that even I had stared at them for a moment, wondering if I had somehow done what they accused me of doing. "They don't make mistakes," I said almost to myself. "That's what you told me in 2008. Whoever did this to you didn't make a single mistake." I remember. Then I need to make sure I don't give them one either. I set the folder back on his desk. "I'm going to stop at Best Buy on the way home. I want cameras in the house before tonight." Samuel looked at me for a long moment, with an expression I could not entirely read, something between professional concern and something older, more personal. Then he said, "You know that whatever you find on those cameras is admissible as evidence as long as they're installed in the common areas of a property you own." "I know," I said. "That's exactly why I'm doing it." On the drive home, I stopped at the Best Buy on Foothill Boulevard and bought 2 small wireless cameras, the kind that mount flush against a wall, barely visible unless you were looking for them, and a motion-activated audio recorder, no bigger than a USB drive. I paid cash. I drove home with the bag on the passenger seat and the folder from Samuel's office on top of it, and I kept both hands steady on the wheel, even though my palms were sweating badly enough that I had to grip harder than usual. Evelyn was in the garden when I pulled into the driveway, kneeling beside her rose beds with dirt on her gloves and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked up when she heard the car and smiled that full unguarded smile she had that still did something complicated to my chest after all these years, and called out, "There's leftover frittata in the oven if you haven't eaten." "Thank you, sweetheart," I called back, and my voice came out warm and steady, and I hated myself a little for how easily it did. I carried the bag inside through the kitchen down the hall and into my home office. I locked the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the desk with the cameras in my hands and looked at the framed photograph of Brandon on the bookshelf, his UCLA graduation day, 21 years old, grinning so wide his eyes had nearly disappeared, holding his diploma up like a trophy he had been waiting his whole life to win. "What did you get yourself into, son?" I asked the photograph. My voice dropped to barely a whisper, and for just a moment, the pain of it hit me so hard, my eyes burned. "And how deep did they pull you in before you understood what you were signing up for?" The photograph did not answer. I set the cameras on the desk and got to work. The first 3 nights, the cameras recorded nothing unusual. I watched the feeds on my phone each morning before Evelyn woke up sitting at the kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn with a cup of coffee. I barely tasted scrolling through hours of empty hallway and undisturbed bookshelves. The home office camera showed my desk, my filing cabinet, my framed engineering certifications on the wall. The hallway camera showed the front door, the coat rack, the narrow stretch of hardwood floor that creaked slightly near the third board from the left. Nothing moved. Nobody came. I began to wonder if I had misread the situation. I began to hope I had. Then Wednesday night arrived, and the camera in my home office woke me up at 2:14 in the morning. The alert buzzed against my nightstand. I grabbed the phone before the second buzz, already sitting upright, already knowing in some deep, wordless place that this was it. Beside me, Evelyn stirred and murmured something without fully waking. I pressed my hand gently to her shoulder. "It's nothing, go back to sleep." And she settled back into the pillow with a soft exhale that broke something small and quiet inside me, because she trusted me so completely, and I was lying to her in the dark. I pulled up the camera feed. Melissa Cole was standing in my home office. She had not turned on the overhead light. She was using the flashlight on her phone, holding it low, and angled at the filing cabinet beside my desk. The 2-drawer unit where I kept tax records, property documents, insurance files, the accumulated paperwork of a life lived carefully. She was dressed in dark clothing, and her movements had the unhurried precision of someone who had thought this through many times before arriving. She opened the top drawer, flipped through the hanging folders with her fingers reading the tabs, found what she was looking for in under 40 seconds, a speed that told me she had been told exactly which file to find. She pulled out a manila folder, opened it on the desk, and removed a document. Even on the small screen of my phone, I could see it clearly, my federal tax return from 2019, the one with my signature at the bottom in the blue ink I always used. She placed it on the glass surface of my flatbed scanner. The scanner's light passed slowly beneath it. She lifted the document, replaced it in the folder, replaced the folder in the drawer, and closed the cabinet. The entire operation took less than 4 minutes. Then she walked out of my office and pulled the door shut behind her without making a sound. I sat in the dark bedroom with the phone in my hand and felt a rage so cold and so complete that it did not feel like anger at all. It felt like clarity. It felt like the moment in 2008 when I had sat in Samuel's office and looked at the forged wire transfer orders and understood with absolute certainty that someone had spent a great deal of time and intelligence destroying me. The same feeling, the same temperature. I sent the video clip to Samuel at 2:17 in the morning with a single line of text forgery in a progress. California Penal Code 470. Keep this. He replied 4 minutes later. Saved and time-stamped. Don't confront them. Let it run. I did not sleep again that night. Thursday evening brought the second recording. Brandon had parked his Range Rover in our driveway at 6:30, telling Evelyn he was stopping by to drop off a bottle of wine and say hello. He stayed 40 minutes sitting at the kitchen table and eating the cookies Evelyn had baked that afternoon, talking about a condominium project in Glendale and asking about my garden and laughing at something on the television. He hugged his mother goodbye at the door. He shook my hand and looked me directly in the eye and said, "Good to see you, Dad," with the easy warmth of a man who had absolutely nothing to hide. Then he walked to his car, got in and sat there. The exterior camera mounted above the garage door, angled to cover the driveway, picked up his voice clearly through the open driver's window. He was parked on my property with his window open, speaking at full volume, and he believed he was alone. He was not. "I'll have the deed transferred before Monday morning," he said. "She's already got the signature scanned. We just need him to sign the actual transfer document Sunday." A voice on the other end, male unhurried, carrying the particular flatness of a man accustomed to giving instructions and having them followed, said, "Make sure it happens before 8. And Brandon, we need full demolition rights to the basement written into the transfer agreement." Brandon's voice shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight change in register, the kind you would miss if you were not listening for it. "Demolition rights. Why would they want that in their skills?" That's not your concern," the voice said. "The less you know about specific terms, the better off you are." "But what's in the basement? It's just storage. The old man never even goes down there." "Brandon," the voice hardened by exactly 1 degree. "The less you know, the longer you live. Get the signature. Get the demolition rights. That is all you need to worry about." The call ended. Brandon sat in the car for another 30 seconds. Then he started the engine and backed out of the driveway. I watched the clip 4 times. Each time the phrase landed in my chest with a different weight. The less you know, the longer you live. Not a figure of speech, not a colorful expression. A specific kind of warning, the kind that carried its own history. I went downstairs, poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass, and stood at the kitchen sink, looking out the window at the driveway where Brandon's car had been parked. Evelyn came in behind me and wrapped both arms around me from behind, pressing her cheek between my shoulder blades, the way she had done for 23 years, when she sensed I was carrying something too heavy. "You've been somewhere else all week," she said against my back. Her voice was muffled and warm and so full of love that my throat tightened until it hurt. "Walter, whatever it is, you can tell me." My hands gripped the edge of the sink. The bourbon sat untouched on the counter. "I know I can," I said, and my voice was steady, and the steadiness of it cost me more than almost anything I had ever done. I walked to the basement door at the end of the hallway and stood with my hand on the frame. The door was old solid wood, painted white so many times the paint had built up around the hinges and made them stiff. Thomas had painted it himself the summer after I moved into this house. He had stood on a stepladder in his careful way, applying the paint in long, even strokes, and he had said, without turning around, "Remember the V-crack, son." For the most desperate of times. I had laughed. I had thought it was an old man's eccentricity, a little ceremony he had invented to feel useful. I was not laughing now. I took my hand off the door frame and walked back to the kitchen. I picked up the bourbon. I drank it in a single swallow that burned all the way down and did absolutely nothing to warm the cold place that had been spreading through my chest since 2:14 Wednesday morning. Sunday was coming, and I needed to be ready. Friday morning arrived the way bad days often do, quietly, without warning, wearing the face of something ordinary. Evelyn made pancakes. She stood at the stove in her yellow apron, humming something I could not identify, and the smell of butter and maple syrup filled the kitchen with such stubborn warmth that I had to grip the edge of my coffee mug just to keep myself anchored to what I knew was true. She slid a plate in front of me and kissed the top of my head, the way she had done 10,000 mornings before, and I looked down at the pancakes and felt the back of my throat burn with something I absolutely could not afford to let become tears. "You're not eating," she said, sitting across from me. "Just thinking." She pointed her fork at me with the directness of a woman who had run out of patience for evasion. "Walter Bennett, you have been just thinking for 5 days straight. You're going to think yourself into an early grave." She softened it with a small smile, but her eyes were doing the thing they always did, reading me, measuring me, finding the place where I was hiding the weight. "Brandon called this morning," she said. "He confirmed Sunday. He sounded good, relaxed." The pancakes turned to something tasteless in my mouth. "That's good," I said. After breakfast, I told Evelyn I needed to spend the day in the office catching up on consulting work. She accepted this without question, which made me love her and hate myself in equal measure. I locked the office door, sat down at my desk, and spent 2 hours transferring every property document, every insurance file, every piece of paper, with my signature on it, to an encrypted cloud account that Brandon and Melissa did not know existed. I emailed copies to Samuel. Then I charged the backup phone, a small prepaid device I had bought years ago and never used, small enough to fit in the inner breast pocket of my wool jacket, until the battery read 100%. I held the little phone in my palm for a long moment. It was a modest thing, barely larger than a deck of cards. Brandon and Melissa would take my regular phone on Sunday. They would not think to look for this one. That afternoon, I opened the basement door for the first time in longer than I could remember. The smell hit me, first cool, damp air carrying the particular mustiness of a space that had been sealed too long, a smell like old paper and concrete and time itself. I found the light switch and pulled the string, and the single bulb at the bottom of the stairs cast everything in a yellowish glow that made the fieldstone walls look ancient and secretive. I went down slowly, one hand on the railing, feeling each step take me further from the ordinary world of pancakes and morning light and Evelyn's voice. The basement was mostly empty now, a few old moving boxes stacked against one wall, a folding table I kept meaning to bring upstairs, the water heater humming steadily in the corner. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would explain why Crown Meridian needed demolition rights down here. But I was not looking for something remarkable. I was looking for something specific. I crossed to the far wall, the one built from rough fieldstone, older than the rest of the house, older, perhaps, than anything else on Marengo Avenue. I ran my palm slowly across the surface. The stones were cold and slightly damp, and the mortar between them had darkened with decades of moisture. Most of the stones were perfectly solid under pressure. I pressed each one, carefully working left to right, top to bottom, the way Thomas had taught me to read a balance sheet systematically, without rushing, trusting the process over the instinct. Thomas. I could see him so clearly it made my chest ache, the careful way he moved through the world, the deliberateness of every gesture, the way he had brought me down here when I was perhaps 11 or 12 years old and shown me the wall with the gravity of a man imparting something sacred. I had been impatient that day. I had wanted to go outside and ride my bicycle. I had paid just enough attention to remember and not enough to understand. Remember the V-crack sun for the most desperate of times? My fingers stopped. There it was, faint, worn, smooth by years and humidity, but unmistakable once you were looking for it. A hairline fracture running diagonally across one stone, then doubling back, forming the precise shape of the letter V. I pressed the stone beneath it. It moved. Not dramatically, not with any cinematic grinding of ancient machinery, just a slight deliberate give under my palm, the resistance of something that had been placed with intention and could be removed with intention. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my back teeth. I did not pull the stone out. Not yet. Sunday was 36 hours away, and I needed Brandon and Melissa in this house when the truth came to light. I needed witnesses. I needed the whole terrible architecture of what they had built to be standing when it came down. I pressed the stone back into place, turned off the basement light, and walked back upstairs. Evelyn was in the garden. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her for a long moment, her hands moving through the rose beds, her lips moving slightly the way they did when she was talking to the plants, the late afternoon sun catching the silver in her hair and turning it briefly to gold. One more day, I thought. Hold on one more day. They arrived at 4 o'clock on the dot. I heard Brandon's Range Rover before I saw it, the particular sound of its engine dropping to idle as it turned into our driveway, unhurried and deliberate, the sound of a man who believed he was arriving to collect something that already belonged to him. I was standing in the living room when the car doors closed and I pressed my hand briefly against the breast pocket of my wool jacket, feeling the small, hard rectangle of the prepaid phone through the fabric. Still there, still charged. Evelyn came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face open and warm in the way it always was when Brandon visited. That expression, the unguarded love of a mother who did not yet know what I knew, made something in my chest twist so painfully I had to look away. The doorbell rang. Evelyn reached it first. "There he is," she said, pulling Brandon into a hug that he returned with both arms, squeezing her tight, his chin resting on top of her head. He was smiling when he stepped back, that broad, easy smile that had charmed teachers and coaches and business partners for his entire adult life. Beside him, Melissa stood in a cream-colored silk blouse and tailored slacks, her dark hair pulled back in a chignon, carrying a leather portfolio case in one hand and a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet in the other. "We brought wine," Melissa said, holding up the bottle with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "How lovely," Evelyn said, reaching for it. "I'll open it while you boys talk." "Actually," Brandon said, and something in his voice shifted just enough that Evelyn paused with the bottle in her hands. "We should probably all sit down together. There's some family business we need to go over." We sat in the living room, Brandon and Melissa on the sofa, Evelyn and I in the armchairs across from them. Brandon set the leather portfolio on the coffee table and unzipped it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. He removed a document roughly 12 pages long, paper-clipped and tabbed with colored sticky notes marking the signature lines. "Dad," he said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, "I want to be upfront with you. The company is in serious trouble. We're talking about defaulting on loans that would wipe out everything Melissa and I have built over the last 8 years. His voice carried the right note of vulnerability, just enough to be convincing, not enough to be pathetic. Crown Meridian has agreed to restructure the debt, but they need collateral, real collateral. He slid the document across the coffee table toward me. I looked at the cover page without touching it. Deed of transfer. Grantor Walter R. Bennett. Grantee Meridian Pacific Holdings. LLC consideration. $1 and other valuable consideration. "You want me to sign over this house?" I said, "for $1. "It's a nominal consideration deed, Dad. It's a legal mechanism. It doesn't mean the house is actually worth $1. It's just how the transfer is structured for tax purposes. Crown Meridian holds it as security. The debt gets restructured, and in 18 months when the market recovers, everything reverts." He said it smoothly, quickly, with the cadence of someone reciting something memorized. We've had 3 attorneys look at this. Evelyn had gone very still in her chair. Her hands were pressed flat against her thighs, and she was looking at Brandon with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not fear, but a particular kind of focused attention, the look of a woman who was hearing something she desperately wanted to misunderstand. I picked up the document. I read the first 3 pages, slowly turning each one with deliberate care. I found the clause on page 7. "Grantee shall retain full rights to structural modification, renovation, and demolition of all structures on the property, including below-grade spaces." Below-grade spaces. The basement. I set the document down on the coffee table and looked at my son. "Why does Crown Meridian need demolition rights to the basement?" I asked. The smile did not leave Brandon's face, but something behind his eyes changed a door, closing very quickly behind a very careful expression. Beside him, Melissa's fingers tightened around the strap of her portfolio. "It's standard language," Brandon said. "Boilerplate for any property transfer. It doesn't mean—" "Brandon?" My voice was quiet and level, the way it got when I was most serious. "I have been reading contracts for 50 years. That is not boilerplate." The room changed. I felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, a subtle shift, a tightening of something invisible. Melissa stood up first. She moved to the front door with quick, efficient steps, and I heard the deadbolt turn, a sound so deliberate it seemed to echo. Then she reached into her pocket and held out her hand toward Evelyn. "Your phones," she said. "Both of you." Evelyn made a sound, a sharp, wounded sound, barely a syllable, and looked at her son with her eyes filling fast. "Brandon, what is happening? What are you doing?" Brandon was on his feet now, and the easy smile was completely gone. What replaced it was something harder and more frightened, the face of a man who had gone too far down a road to turn around. "Dad, just sign the papers, please. I am asking you, just sign them, and we can all walk away from this and go back to normal." "There is no back to normal," I said, and I stood up too slowly, feeling every one of my 70 years in my knees. "Not after this." His hand closed around my wrist. Not violently, but with a grip that meant business, the grip of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it. He pulled me toward the hallway, toward the basement door, and I let him, because fighting him physically would accomplish nothing, and might hurt Evelyn, who was trying to get between us, her voice breaking completely now, crying his name over and over in a way that tore at something deep in me. Melissa caught Evelyn's arm and pulled her back. Evelyn cried out a full, raw sound of shock and pain, and I lunged toward her instinctively, catching her before she stumbled, putting my body between her and Melissa for just a moment. That moment was enough for Brandon to get the basement door open. He pushed us both through it. The door slammed behind us. The bolt drove home with a sound like a coffin lid. Darkness, complete and absolute. Evelyn was crying against my chest. Not delicate tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Her hands fisting in the front of my jacket. "Walter," she gasped between sobs. "Walter, that's my son. That's my boy. What is he doing? What is he doing?" I wrapped both arms around her and held on. My own eyes were burning badly now, burning in a way I had not felt since the worst night of 2008, and I pressed my lips together hard and breathed through my nose and refused to let it break open. "Listen to me," I said into her hair low and steady. "Listen, they don't know what Thomas left behind that wall, and that is the only thing that matters right now." Evelyn's sobs were the only sound in the world for a long time. I held her on the basement steps with both arms wrapped around her shoulders, feeling her whole body shake with each wave of crying, and I kept my cheek pressed against her hair and my eyes open in the darkness because I needed to think, and grief, even someone else's grief, has a way of pulling you under if you close your eyes and let it. He looked me in the eye. She choked out between sobs. Her fingers twisted into my jacket lapel so tightly I could feel the fabric pulling. At Christmas, at your birthday dinner, he looked me in the eye every single time, and he was already planning this. My own boy, Walter. My own boy. "I know," I said, "and I did know in the specific way you know something that has not yet finished hurting you." She pulled back just enough to look up at me, and even in the near-total darkness, I could see the wet tracks on her face, the way her chin was trembling with the effort of trying to hold herself together. "How long have you known?" she demanded, and her voice cracked on the last word, but her eyes were fierce. Evelyn had never been a woman who stayed broken for long. "How long, Walter?" "Since last Saturday," I said. "Samuel found the loan documents. I should have told you. I was trying to protect you, and I was wrong to make that choice alone." I held her gaze in the dark. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I am genuinely sorry." She pressed her lips together so hard they went white. Then she pulled in a long, shuddering breath and straightened her spine with the kind of deliberate effort that reminded me of why I had fallen in love with her 25 years ago. "Tell me everything," she said. "Right now, all of it." So I told her. Standing on the basement steps in the dark, keeping my voice low and steady, I told her about Samuel's office, and the loan documents, and the cameras, and Melissa with the scanner, and Brandon in the driveway saying the less you know the longer you live. I told her about Crown Meridian and what they had done to Bennett Infrastructure 15 years ago. I told her about the demolition rights clause, and what it meant that they specifically needed access to this basement. By the time I finished, Evelyn had stopped crying. She was sitting very straight on the step, with her hands clasped in her lap, and her expression had moved through grief and out the other side into something harder and more purposeful. "Thomas," she said. "This is about what Thomas left here." "Yes." She looked toward the far wall, invisible in the darkness, but she knew the layout of this house as well as I did. "Then we need to find it. Right now, Walter, whatever it is." I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out the prepaid phone. The screen lit up the immediate space around us just enough. I turned it toward the far wall and stood up carefully. "Stay here," I said. "I know where to look." The fieldstone wall was cold under my palms as I worked my way across it, using the phone's glow to guide me while I let my fingers do the actual searching. The stones were uneven and damp, and more than once my foot caught on the uneven concrete floor and sent a spike of pain up my bad knee. I kept moving. Thomas's voice came back to me with startling clarity. Not as a memory, but as a presence the way the voices of the dead sometimes feel more immediate than the voices of the living. The V-crack, son. You'll know it when your fingers find it. And then, my fingers found it. The fracture was fainter than I remembered from Friday, or perhaps it only seemed that way because my hands were shaking now, in a way they had not been during my calm, solitary practice run. I pressed the stone beneath the V with my palm, and it moved, and the sound it made, that soft, deliberate grinding of stone on stone, was the most significant sound I had ever heard in my life. I looked back at Evelyn. Her face in the phone's glow was wet and fierce and absolutely steady. "Walter," she said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Pull it out." Before I reveal what was written in that letter, the secret Thomas had kept for 43 years, I need to know you're still with me. Drop the number 7 in the comments right now, because what's inside that envelope is going to change everything you think you know about this story. A note: this story contains some fictional elements crafted for reflection and storytelling. If that's not what you're here for, no hard feelings, you can step away now. But if you stay, I promise it will be worth it. The stone came out in my hands like something that had been waiting a very long time to be held. It was heavier than it looked. Dense fieldstone, rough on the edges where the mortar had broken away, smooth in the center where decades of careful replacement had worn it down. I set it on the basement floor and turned the phone's light into the cavity behind it. The space was roughly the size of a shoebox. Inside, sitting on a small wooden shelf that Thomas must have built himself, were three things: a metal safe no larger than a hardcover book, its surface filmed with dust and age, a yellowed envelope sealed with tape that had gone brittle, and a small key on a plain ring with the single letter A stamped into its bow. Evelyn had come up beside me without my hearing her move. She was pressing so close her shoulder was against mine, and I could feel her breathing fast and shallow, the breath of someone who is frightened and refusing to show it. "The envelope first," she said. I carried everything back to the steps where we had the most light from the phone screen. My hands were steadier than I expected. I peeled the brittle tape away from the envelope flap and removed a single folded page covered on both sides in Thomas Hale's precise accountant's handwriting, the same narrow, upright letters that had filled the margins of my homework corrections for 12 years. I read the first line aloud. "Walter, if you are reading this letter, it means the people who took your real parents have finally found the house." Evelyn grabbed my arm with both hands. Her nails dug in through the fabric of my jacket sleeve, and she made a sound, not a word, just a sound low and involuntary, like someone who has just stepped off a curb they did not see coming. I kept reading. "Thomas wrote that he was not my father by blood. He had been for 31 years the chief accountant of Ashford Holdings, a construction and infrastructure company founded in Los Angeles by a man named Jonathan Ashford. My father, my real father, whose face I had never seen and whose name I had never heard spoken until this moment, standing in a dark basement at 70 years old, with my wife's hands shaking on my arm. Jonathan Ashford had built Ashford Holdings from a single civil engineering contract in 1965 into one of the largest construction conglomerates on the eastern seaboard. He was, Thomas wrote, a man of extraordinary intelligence and equally extraordinary integrity. The kind of man who believed that a company's reputation was its most valuable asset and protected it accordingly. In 1980, Jonathan began to suspect that his vice president, a man named Malcolm Crane, was using Ashford Holdings construction projects to move money for a criminal financial network. Shell companies receiving inflated subcontractor payments, funds cycling through project accounts and emerging clean on the other side. Jonathan spent 8 months documenting it, quietly building a case file that Thomas described as airtight. He never got to deliver it. On the 14th of March, 1955, Jonathan Ashford and his wife were killed when their car left the Freeway 5 interchange south of Los Angeles and went down an embankment. The official finding was driver error. Thomas wrote that he had never believed it for a single day of his life. I had to stop reading, not because I could not continue, but because something was happening in my chest that required a moment, a pressure building behind my sternum that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but contained elements of both pressing outward against my ribs, like something that needed more space than my body could give it. Evelyn put her hand flat against my back. "Keep going," she said softly. "Walter, keep going." Thomas wrote that he had been in the Ashford Holdings office the night it happened. He had received a call from Jonathan earlier that day, a brief, careful call, the kind a man makes when he is not certain his phone is secure, saying that the documents were ready and the meeting with the federal prosecutor was scheduled for the following week. Jonathan had one request. If anything happened to him before that meeting, Thomas was to take the child, Walter James Ashford, 18 months old, currently with a nanny at the family home in Bel Air, and disappear. Something happened to him before that meeting. Thomas drove to the Bel Air house that same night. He took me from my crib. I was 18 months old, fast asleep. Thomas was 31. He drove north through the darkness with an 18-month-old child strapped into a car seat he had bought at an all-night drugstore on the way, and he did not stop driving until he reached a motel in Fresno where he paid cash and sat in a plastic chair until morning, holding me in his arms and making the calculations that would define the rest of his life. He applied for legal guardianship through a sympathetic family court judge in Sacramento who owed him a professional debt. He registered my new name, Walter Bennett, in a county with no digital records at the time. He filed papers in Los Angeles claiming that the Ashford infant had died of illness 3 months after the accident. He moved us first to the Bay Area, then to Altadena, then finally, when I was 6 years old, to the small house in the hills, where I grew up believing I was the son of a quiet accountant who had never quite learned how to say he loved me. "Oh, Thomas," Evelyn whispered, and her voice broke clean in half on his name. I folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands. My eyes were burning so badly the phone screen was blurring. I pressed the back of my hand against them hard and breathed through it. "My name," I said. My voice came out rough and strange in my own ears. "My real name is Walter James Ashford." Evelyn took the letter from my hands very gently, the way you take something fragile from someone who is gripping it too tight. She pressed it flat against her chest and looked at me with tears running freely down her face and said fiercely through all of it, "Your name is Walter, and you are the same man you were an hour ago. Do you hear me? You are exactly the same man." I reached for her hand and held it so tightly she winced, and neither of us let go. The key was smaller than I expected, for something that had been waiting 43 years to be used. I held it in my palm under the phone's light, a simple brass key worn smooth with age, the letter A stamped cleanly into the bow. My thumb moved across the stamped letter the way you might touch the name on a headstone, slowly, deliberately, acknowledging something. "The safe," Evelyn said. She was sitting beside me on the basement steps, close enough that her knee pressed against mine, and the warmth of that contact was the most grounding thing in the world right now. Her voice had steadied itself back into something controlled, though I could see by the set of her jaw how much effort that was costing her. I inserted the key. The mechanism resisted decades of disuse, the slight swelling of metal in a damp environment, and I had to apply firm, even pressure before I felt it turn. The safe door swung open with a soft sound that seemed far too quiet for the magnitude of the moment. Thomas had lined the interior with oilcloth to protect against the basement's moisture. He had built the shelf and sealed the wall in 1981, 26 years after the night he drove north, with me in a car seat when I was grown, and had a house of my own, and he finally had somewhere safe to put the truth. He had thought of everything the way a man thinks of everything, when he knows he will not be there to fix mistakes. I began removing the contents one by one, setting each item carefully on the step beside Evelyn. First, a birth certificate. The paper was heavy stock. The official seal of Los Angeles County still clearly embossed in the upper left corner. The name on the certificate read, Walter James Ashford. Mother Catherine Marie Ashford, née Holloway. Father Jonathan Reed Ashford. Date of birth, the same date I had celebrated as my own, every year of my life, because that much at least had been real. Evelyn picked it up with both hands and held it under the phone light. Her chin began trembling again, but she pressed her lips together hard and kept reading. Second, a photograph. It was a 4x6 print, the colors slightly faded in the way photographs from the early 1980s fade, the whites going cream, the blues going gray, but the subjects were perfectly clear. A man and a woman sitting on what appeared to be a porch or a terrace, sunlight behind them, and between them, held in the man's arms, a small child of perhaps a year old. The man had my eyes, not similar to my eyes, the exact same shape, the exact same slight downward turn at the outer corners that I had always attributed to some vague Bennett family trait and never questioned. He had my shoulders, my jaw the particular way I hold my head slightly forward when I am thinking hard about something. He was laughing in the photograph, looking down at the baby in his arms, and even faded and 40 years old, the laugh was so alive it hurt to look at. I made a sound that I had not planned on making. It came from somewhere below my throat, somewhere I did not have a name for. And it was not a word and not quite a sob, but it was the sound of something very old and very fundamental shifting inside me. "That's your father," Evelyn said. Her voice had gone soft and careful, the voice she used when she was handling something she was afraid of dropping. "Walter, that's Jonathan." I could not speak. I pressed my fist against my mouth and breathed through my nose and looked at the photograph until my vision steadied. Third, the stock certificates, a full set of founders' shares and Ashford holdings, made out to Jonathan Reed Ashford with a trust notation at the bottom indicating transfer to an irrevocable trust managed by a Delaware trust company. Thomas had annotated the margin in his careful handwriting, trust maintained through all subsequent mergers and acquisitions. Beneficiary Walter James Ashford. Current equivalent value estimated in attached document. I did not look at the attached document. That was a problem for another day. Fourth 12 ledger books, each numbered on the spine, each filled with Thomas's accountant's handwriting, columns of figures, company names, account numbers, dates. Decades of careful documentation, the paper trail of a man who had spent his entire adult life building a case he was never certain would ever be used. Fifth, a small plastic box containing 3 cassette tapes, each labeled in Thomas's hand. Malcolm Crane Board Meeting, March 1981. The recordings that Jonathan had made before he died. The evidence that had never reached the federal prosecutor. And sixth, at the very bottom of the safe, wrapped in a square of clean cotton cloth, a USB drive. Modern compact, the kind you could buy at any office supply store. A label in Thomas's handwriting, dated just 8 months before his death. Current entities. Updated 2009. My hands had started shaking again. I pressed them flat against my thighs for a moment and breathed deliberately in for 4 counts out. For 4 counts, the technique a Navy friend had taught me 30 years ago, for moments when the body wants to run before the mind has finished thinking. I plugged the USB into the prepaid phone. A single folder opened. Inside a document titled, Network Current Active Entities Running to 11 Pages. Thomas had spent the last years of his life tracking the evolution of Malcolm Crane's organization through every name change, every restructuring, every generational handoff, from Crane to his son's associates. I scrolled to the final page. The last entry was dated October 2009, 2 months before Thomas died. It read, Crown Meridian Capital LLC, Century City, Los Angeles. Current primary operating entity. Confirmed active. Evelyn made a sharp sound beside me, not a word, just the involuntary sound of breath, leaving a body too fast. She grabbed my wrist with both hands and squeezed hard enough to hurt. Walter, she said, and her voice was shaking so badly the word barely held together. The company that destroyed Bennett Infrastructure, the company that's been standing behind Brandon this whole time, Thomas was tracking them. He knew it was them, and he tracked them for 30 years. And he left you the proof. And they knew the proof was here, I said. My voice came out very quiet and very flat. That's why they needed the basement, not the house, the basement. Evelyn's grip on my wrist tightened until I could feel her pulse against my skin, fast and hard, running like a frightened thing. Then she straightened up and looked me directly in the eye with an expression that reminded me of exactly why I had married her. Then stop sitting here, she said fiercely, and call Samuel. I moved to the corner of the basement, nearest the small window, set high in the foundation wall, a rectangle of glass, no larger than a picture frame level, with the ground outside, through which I could see the faint orange glow of the streetlight on Marengo Avenue. It was the one spot in the basement where my prepaid phone showed a single bar of signal, and right now, a single bar was everything. Samuel answered on the second ring. Walter? His voice was alert in a way that told me he had not been sleeping. He had probably been sitting by his phone since Sunday afternoon waiting. That was Samuel. He did not pace, he did not call repeatedly to check in. He simply positioned himself and held still and was ready when the moment arrived. Talk to me. I talked. I kept my voice low and level, and I did not leave anything out. I told him about the safe and the key and the birth certificate with the Los Angeles County seal. I told him about the photograph of Jonathan Ashford, my eyes, my jaw, my shoulders, and what it had done to me. To see my own face looking back from 1981. I told him about the ledger books and the cassette tapes and the USB drive that Thomas had updated 2 months before he died, and the final entry that read, Crown Meridian Capital LLC, Century City, Los Angeles, confirmed active. When I finished, the line was quiet for a count of 4. Then Samuel said, Walter, I need to tell you something I should have told you in 2008. His voice had changed lower, rougher, carrying the particular weight of a man confessing something he had carried too long. When we lost that case, I hired a forensic accountant out of my own pocket to look at the wire transfers. She told me the forgery was too clean. She said it had the hallmarks of a professional operation, not corporate fraud, something older and more organized. I couldn't prove it, and I had nothing to point at. So I never told you, because I didn't want to give you a target you couldn't reach. My jaw tightened so hard it ached. You're telling me now. I'm telling you now, he said, because now you have the target, and I have a phone number. He explained quickly. The FBI's Los Angeles field office had an open investigation on Crown Meridian for money laundering through real estate transactions, had been building it for 3 years quietly, without enough connective tissue to tie the current organization to its criminal origins. The case agent was a woman named Diana Reyes. Samuel had crossed paths with her 6 months ago at a Federal Bar Association dinner, and she had given him her card because she said she had a feeling that sometime in the next few years, someone was going to walk into his office with exactly what she was missing. She said that, I asked. Those exact words, Samuel said. I thought she was being dramatic. I kept the card anyway. He put me on hold. I stood in the basement corner with the phone pressed to my ear and looked across the room at Evelyn, who was sitting on the steps with the photograph of Jonathan Ashford held carefully in both hands, studying it in the phone's fading light, with an expression on her face that I could not entirely read, something between sorrow and wonder, and a fierce protective tenderness, as if she were looking at a version of me she had never been allowed to know. The hold music cut off. Samuel came back on the line, and his voice had changed again, sharper now, moving faster. Reyes picked up immediately. He said, Walter, she already knows the name Ashford. The federal file from 1981 lists an infant survivor whose death documentation was flagged as potentially irregular. Back in 1994, somebody noticed the timing was off, but there was nothing to follow. She's been sitting on that flag for years. Something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the basement temperature. I sent her the photographs you texted me of the ledger pages, Samuel continued. She had her forensic accountant on the phone within 8 minutes. The account numbers in Thomas's ledgers match account structures currently associated with Crown Meridian's shell company network. Not similar identical architecture, same numbering system, same cycling pattern updated for current banking regulations, but built on the same original framework. The same people, I said. The same organization, Samuel corrected. Different generation, same machine. He paused. Walter, this is what Reyes has been trying to build for 3 years. Thomas's documentation is the connective tissue she's been missing. The cassette tapes alone, if they contain what the labels suggest, could be enough to establish continuity of criminal enterprise going back to 1981. Evelyn had looked up from the photograph. She was watching my face the way she always did when she could not hear both sides of a conversation, but needed to understand what was coming. I mouthed, "They're moving tonight." Her eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, they were wet, but her chin was steady and her back was straight, and she nodded once hard like a woman driving a nail. "There's something else," I said into the phone. "Brandon and Melissa locked us in the basement tonight. We've been down here for—" I checked the phone's clock. Close to 5 hours. Under California Penal Code 236, that's felony false imprisonment. And Evelyn and I are both over 65, which makes it elder abuse under Penal Code 368, enhanced charges. Samuel made a sound that was half legal satisfaction and half fury. That establishes your exigent circumstances right there. False imprisonment in progress plus imminent destruction of evidence. Reyes can have an emergency warrant signed within the hour without going through standard channels. She doesn't need to wait for a judge to open his office in the morning. He paused. Walter, do not let them take anything out of that basement. If Melissa comes down those stairs, you stall, you argue, you make noise. Understood. Are you hurt? Is Evelyn hurt? I looked at Evelyn on the steps, her ruined silk blouse, her hair falling loose from where it had been pinned this morning, the mark on her forearm, where Melissa had grabbed her. She was holding a 43-year-old photograph of my dead father, and meeting my eyes with an expression of absolute unshakable steadiness. "We're all right," I said. "Stay on the line with me until—" Upstairs a floorboard creaked, then another. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crossing the kitchen floor toward the basement door. "Samuel," I said quietly, "they're coming back." "I hear you. Reyes is already rolling. Walter." His voice dropped to something urgent and very direct. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes, do not sign anything. Do not let them take the safe. And keep that line open as long as I can hear what's happening down there. Reyes has everything she needs to establish exigent circumstances. False imprisonment in progress, imminent destruction of evidence, that's enough to get her team through your door right now without waiting on a judge." The basement door bolt began to slide. I pocketed the phone without ending the call, pressed my back against the wall beside the steps, and looked at Evelyn. She stood up from the step, set the photograph down carefully on the wooden shelf beside the open safe, and squared her shoulders toward the door at the top of the stairs. "Ready?" I said. "I have been ready," she said, "since the moment the bolt locked. In just a moment, one accidental button press is going to expose everything. Before that happens, comment the number 10 below. Let me know you're still here because you don't want to miss what comes next. Not for anything." Please note, some narrative details in this story have been constructed for storytelling and reflection purposes. If this kind of content isn't your preference, you're welcome to choose something else, but thank you for getting this far with me. The door swung open and Brandon filled the frame at the top of the stairs. He had loosened his tie and rolled his sleeves to the elbow, and there was a tightness around his eyes that had not been there at 4 o'clock this afternoon. The particular look of a man who has spent several hours in the company of his own bad decisions, and found them worse than expected. He held the transfer documents in one hand and a bottle of water in the other, and for one surreal moment, the water seemed like the most obscene detail in the world. This small gesture of consideration from a man who had locked his parents in a basement. "Okay," he said, coming down the first 3 steps and stopping there, keeping the high ground. His voice was carefully modulated, not aggressive, not apologetic, simply businesslike in the way that people are businesslike when they are trying to pretend a situation is more normal than it is. "You've had time to think. Let's finish this tonight so everyone can move on." His eyes moved across the basement and found the open safe, found the ledger book stacked on the step beside Evelyn, found the birth certificate, the photograph, the USB drive still plugged into my phone. The water bottle dropped from his hand. It hit the concrete floor and rolled away spinning, and Brandon stood there with his mouth slightly open and the transfer documents hanging loose in his fingers. And I watched the careful businesslike composure drain out of his face like water out of a cracked bowl. "What is that?" he said. His voice had gone up half an octave. "What did you find down here? What is all of that?" "The truth," I said, "about the people who have been standing behind you." He came down the remaining steps in a rush, not toward me, but toward the safe, reaching for the ledger books with a desperation that made my stomach turn. I stepped between him and the steps, not blocking him physically, but making my position clear, and he stopped short and looked at me with something in his eyes I had not seen there before. Something that looked underneath all the panic, like the beginning of genuine fear. Melissa appeared at the top of the stairs. She took in the open safe, the documents, the photograph, and her face did something I had not expected. It did not show panic the way Brandon's had. It showed calculation, a rapid, cold recalibration, the expression of someone who has just discovered that the problem is larger than the plan accounted for, and is already building a new plan while the old one is still falling apart. She pulled out her phone. She dialed a number that was clearly already saved. She turned to Brandon and said flatly, "You need to hear this," and put it on speaker. Brandon's eyes were still fixed on the open safe, on the ledger books, on the birth certificate with the Los Angeles County seal. He was not looking at me. Neither was Melissa. In that moment, I understood they had stopped seeing us entirely. We had become in their minds an already solved problem, and the unsolved problem was the safe and what it meant, and what was coming next. That was the only reason I was still standing in the same room as a live phone call to the man behind all of it. The line connected. A man's voice filled the basement. "Is it done?" Melissa turned away from Brandon and lowered her voice. "There's a problem," she said. "There's a problem," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as if lowering her own volume could compensate for the speakerphone. "He found something in the basement. Documents, old files, there's a safe." The voice on the other end changed. Not louder, colder. The specific coldness of a man whose patience has just run out in a very permanent way. "How much did he find?" "Everything." Her voice cracked on the word. "I think it's everything." A pause of perhaps 3 seconds. Then, "Get whatever you can carry and burn the house. The basement has to go. Do it now tonight." Brandon made a sound like he had been punched in the chest. He grabbed Melissa's arm and spun her toward him, and his face had gone the color of old chalk. "They said they just needed the collateral," he said, his voice fracturing at the edges. "They said it was a business arrangement. They said nobody was going to get hurt." "Brandon," the voice from the speakerphone was utterly flat. "You were never a partner. You were the key. We needed access to that property and you provided it. That is the full extent of your role." The line went dead. The basement was absolutely quiet for one long moment, and then Evelyn broke it because Evelyn had never in her life allowed a terrible silence to go unconfronted. "My son," she said, and her voice was shaking with a fury I had never heard from her before, a hot and devastating fury that was nothing like grief and nothing like disappointment and everything like a woman who has just watched someone she loved choose with full knowledge to become something she did not recognize. "You brought those people into this house, into our home. You handed them the door, and you held it open, and you told yourself some story about saving your company so you could live with what you were doing." She stepped toward him, and Brandon actually stepped back up one stair. "Did you know they were going to burn it? Did you know that when you drove away and left us down here? Mom, his voice broke completely. His eyes were full and his hands were shaking, and he looked for just a moment like the 9-year-old boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the Rose Bowl parking lot on a Sunday morning. Mom, I swear I didn't know about the house. I didn't know any of this. I was drowning, and they were the only... Stop. Her voice came out hard and clean as a slamming door. Stop talking, Brandon. Just stop. He stopped. His throat worked. A single tear ran down the left side of his face, and he did not wipe it away. I put my hand on Evelyn's arm, not to hold her back, just to let her know I was there, and I looked up the stairs at my son and felt something vast and sorrowful move through me, the specific grief of a man watching someone he loved step off a cliff they had been warned about. Then, the lights outside changed, blue and red, sweeping through the small basement window in slow, deliberate arcs, painting the fieldstone walls in alternating colors. Brandon saw it, first turn toward the window, with a sound in his throat that was half hope and half dread. And in that moment of his distraction, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the prepaid phone. The call to Samuel was still connected, had been connected for 41 minutes. Every word spoken in this basement since the bolt slid open had been recorded and transmitted in real time to a man who was sitting in his car on Marengo Avenue with Agent Diana Reyes of the FBI Los Angeles field office parked directly behind him. Walter? Samuel's voice came through the phone, quiet and certain. We're coming in. The front door came off its hinges with a sound like a gunshot. I felt it through the floor even from the basement, a single concussive thud that shook the foundation and sent a small cascade of dust from the ceiling joists. Then voices, many voices, loud and commanding and overlapping in the specific orchestrated way of people who have rehearsed this FBI don't move hands where I can see them get on the ground FBI. Brandon stood frozen on the basement stairs, with his mouth open and his hands halfway up, before anyone had told him to raise them. The transfer documents fell from his fingers and slid down 3 steps before stopping against my shoe. Melissa moved. She was up the stairs before I fully registered that she had started moving, not running, but fast with the focused efficiency of someone executing a plan. I heard her footsteps cross the kitchen floor, above us heard a drawer open, and close, heard her moving toward the far end of the house. She did not get far. There was a sharp, authoritative shout, a woman's voice close directly above us, and then the sound of a struggle that lasted less than 4 seconds, and then nothing except the continued backdrop of agents moving through the house, calling rooms clear. Agent Diana Reyes appeared at the top of the basement stairs 30 seconds later. She was 48 years old, and built like someone who took the physical fitness requirements of federal service seriously, and had for 20 years. Her dark hair was pulled back under a tactical vest, and she moved down the basement stairs the way experienced agents move through unfamiliar spaces, efficiently, her eyes already cataloging everything in the room before her feet reached the bottom step. She had the kind of face that gave nothing away unless she chose to give it, and right now she was choosing to give very little. Her eyes found the open safe first, then the ledger books, then the USB drive still plugged into my phone, then me. Mr. Bennett, she said. Yes. She reached into her vest and produced a photograph, a printout, recent clearly pulled from a federal database. She held it beside my face and looked back and forth between the two. Then she reached back into her vest and removed something else, a photocopy of a document I recognized immediately as a birth certificate. Los Angeles County Seal. The name at the top read Walter James Ashford. She looked at me for a long moment with those careful cataloging eyes. Is your name Walter James Ashford? She asked. The question landed in the room with a weight I had not prepared for. Not because it was unexpected I had known it was coming, since the moment I read Thomas's letter, but because hearing it spoken aloud by a federal agent in the basement, where I had spent the worst and most clarifying night of my life, made it suddenly irreversibly real in a way that the letter itself had not quite managed. Yes, I said. My voice came out steady. I was proud of that. Reyes nodded slowly. She looked at the safe at the photograph of Jonathan Ashford, still propped against the wall where Evelyn had set it, at the ledger book stacked carefully on the step. Something moved across her face, not quite emotion, but the professional equivalent of it, the expression of someone who has been working toward a destination for a very long time and has just arrived. We've been looking for the Ashford heir for 30 years, she said quietly. The official record listed you as deceased. Infant mortality, Los Angeles County, 1983. She paused. Thomas Hale was thorough. He kept me alive, I said. That was thorough enough. Evelyn made a sound beside me, a short broken exhalation that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, but contained the compressed weight of everything she had processed in the last 3 hours. She pressed the back of her hand hard against her mouth, and I put my arm around her shoulders and held on. Upstairs, I could hear Brandon's voice quieter, now cooperative, answering questions in short sentences. I could not make out the words. I found that I was grateful for that. Melissa Cole, Reyes said, turning toward the stairs and raising her voice slightly for the benefit of the agent at the top. What did you find on her? The agent's voice came down from the kitchen. Canvas tote bag, half-liter fuel container full, home insurance declaration page for this property with account numbers highlighted, architectural floor plan, basement level with the perimeter walls marked in red pen. Evelyn's body went rigid against my side. She made a sound so small and so horrified, it was barely audible, a single syllable of pure shock, like the sound a person makes when they touch something that burns them before they understand what they've touched. She walked in here tonight with fuel, Evelyn said, and her voice was shaking so badly the words barely held their shape. She came into our home with fuel and a floor plan, and she was going to burn it. She was going to burn it with us inside it. Not necessarily with you inside, Reyes said, and her voice was careful and precise. The working theory is that the plan was to secure the transfer documents, first relocate you from the premises, and then execute the arson to destroy the evidence in the basement. The fuel and floor plan were prepared in advance, which indicates premeditation. She looked at Evelyn directly. But I want to be honest with you. The timeline would have been very tight. The implication of that settled into the room like something with physical weight. I looked at the agent and said, "What happens now?" Now, Reyes said, "My team secures all the physical evidence in this room under proper chain of custody. The ledgers, the cassette tapes, the USB drive, the birth certificate, the stock certificates, all of it gets logged and transported to our evidence facility tonight." She looked at the safe. Thomas Hale spent 30 years building this case. We're going to spend the next several months finishing it. She met my eyes. And you, Mr. Ashford, are going to need to come in tomorrow morning and give us a very long statement. She said the name without hesitation, Mr. Ashford, as if it were simply true, which it was, and had always been, which it had. I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been wound tight since the moment I read the first line of Thomas's letter, or perhaps since 2008, or perhaps since longer ago than that, since the very beginning of a life built on a foundation I had not known was there. Reyes started back up the stairs, then paused and turned back. "One more thing," she said. "Brandon Cole is being processed upstairs. He's cooperating." She looked at me steadily. "I thought you should know that before you go up." I nodded. I did not trust my voice on the subject of Brandon Cole right now. Evelyn tightened her grip on my arm with both hands, her fingers pressing in hard, and leaned her head against my shoulder. Her breath was still unsteady, hitching slightly every few exhales, the residue of a night that had asked more of her than any night should. "Walter," she said softly. Just his name, the name she had called me for 23 years. "I know," I said. We stood in the basement that Thomas Hale had built into a vault in the house he had told me never to sell, surrounded by the evidence of a life's worth of quiet and stubborn and patient love. While upstairs the FBI cataloged the ruins of a conspiracy that had been running since before I was old enough to understand what I had lost. For the first time since 4 o'clock this afternoon, I felt the specific and irreplaceable sensation of solid ground under my feet. The sun came up over the San Gabriel Mountains the same way it always did. I was standing on the front porch of my house on Marengo Avenue watching it happen, the slow brightening of the eastern sky, the orange light catching the peaks first and then spilling down into the valley, landing on the oak trees and the jacaranda and the red brick face of my house the same way it had landed there every morning for 22 years. A crime scene technician was loading evidence boxes into a black SUV in my driveway. 2 federal agents were finishing their documentation of the basement. Somewhere inside, a third agent was replacing the front door that had come off its hinges at 2:14 in the morning. Everything looked like aftermath. Evelyn sat in the armchair inside, wrapped in the quilt from our bedroom, holding a mug of tea that Samuel had made her when he came inside after the warrant processing was complete. She had stopped crying somewhere around 4 in the morning, Not because the grief had finished, but because the body eventually runs out of the energy that crying requires, and she had moved into a quieter, more interior kind of pain that I recognized from the worst days of 2008 and knew better than to try to talk her out of. Samuel sat across from her at the kitchen table, with his reading glasses on, going through documents. He had aged visibly in the last few hours. There were lines around his mouth that I did not remember being there yesterday morning, and when he looked up at me as I came in from the porch, his eyes carried something I had not seen in them before. Not guilt exactly, but its close cousin. The look of a man reckoning with a choice he made 15 years ago that he was no longer certain was right. "Now sit down, Walter," he said. "There's a lot to go through." I sat. Evelyn reached across the corner of the table and put her hand over mine without a word, and I turned my palm up and held on. Samuel walked us through it methodically, the way he always worked chronologically, without editorializing, giving us the facts in the order that would make them most comprehensible. Crown Meridian Century City offices had been raided simultaneously with our house. Agents had arrived at the building at 2:30 in the morning, with search warrants covering financial records, communications, and electronic devices. The on-site security guard had cooperated immediately. 3 executives who had been working late. Samuel said this with a particular dryness that suggested he did not find it coincidental that they had been in the office at 2 in the morning on a Sunday had been detained for questioning. The ledger books from Thomas's safe had been matched against Crown Meridian's current financial records within 6 hours. The account architecture was identical, same numbering conventions, same cycling structure, same shell company framework updated across 4 decades, but unmistakably descended from the original system Malcolm Crane had built inside Ashford Holdings in the late 1970s. The forensic accountant Samuel said had used the word genealogical to describe the relationship between the old records and the new ones. The same DNA, different generation. "What about the cassette tapes?" I asked. "Being digitized now? The FBI's audio forensics lab in Quantico has equipment that can recover recordings from the deteriorated magnetic tape." Samuel removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "If the recordings contain what Thomas's labels indicate Malcolm Crane board meeting March 1981, then you potentially have a direct audio record of the conspiracy being planned in Crane's own voice 2 weeks before your parents died." Evelyn's hand tightened on mine. She did not say anything, but her grip told me everything about what that sentence had done to her. "Brandon," I said it the way you probe a wound carefully with one finger, not certain you want to know how deep it goes. Samuel put his glasses back on. "Brandon has been charged with 5 counts. False imprisonment of an elder, that's a felony under California Penal Code 236, with the elder abuse enhancement under 368, because you and Evelyn are both over 65. Mortgage fraud under Federal Title 18, forgery under California Penal Code 470, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud." He paused. "He's cooperating with the federal investigation. He's been providing information about his communication chain with Crown Meridian since approximately 3 this morning." "Does he know?" I asked. "About who I really am?" "The agents told him during processing." Samuel's voice was careful. His response from what Reyes relayed to me was to sit down on the floor of the processing room and put his face in his hands. Evelyn made a sound that was not quite a sob, more like the sound of something tearing slowly, a sound that came from too deep inside her to be called crying. She pulled her hand away from mine and pressed both palms flat against her face, her shoulders curving inward, her whole body contracting around the pain of it. I pushed my chair back and went to her. I crouched beside her chair and put my hand on her back and felt her shaking under my palm. Not the violent shaking of the basement, but a deep interior trembling, like a building settling after a seismic event. "He sat down on the floor," she said from behind her hands. Her voice was muffled and wrecked and absolutely precise. "My son found out the man he locked in a basement was his father's real self, a man he never knew, a man who lost everything twice to the same people, and he sat down on the floor." She dropped her hands and looked at me, and her eyes were red and swollen and burning with something that was not grief anymore, but something more complicated and more permanent. "I don't know what to do with that, Walter. I genuinely do not know what to do with that." "You don't have to know yet," I said. "Not today." She nodded once jerkily, like a woman trying to convince herself that this was an acceptable answer. Samuel cleared his throat gently. "There is one more thing." He slid a document across the table, a single-page official letterhead, Department of Justice. Melissa Cole entered into a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office at 5:47 this morning. In exchange for a reduced charge and sentencing consideration, she has agreed to provide full testimony about Crown Meridian's instructions to her, including the preparation of the arson materials, the communication chain, and the identities of the individuals who directed the operation. I looked at the document without picking it up. She's going to testify against Crown Meridian. And against Brandon, Samuel said quietly. The cooperation agreement covers everything. The kitchen was quiet for a moment, except for the sound of the agents finishing their work in the basement below us, the occasional crackle of a radio, the ordinary sounds of a Monday morning beginning outside on Marengo Avenue. Then Evelyn straightened in her chair. Not all the way, she did not have the energy for all the way, but enough. Enough to pick up her mug of tea with both hands and look out the kitchen window at the rose beds she had tended for 15 years, and say in a voice that was rough and tired and absolutely resolute, "What do we do next, Samuel?" Samuel looked at her over his reading glasses with an expression that I think was the closest thing to admiration I had ever seen on his professional face. "Next," he said, "we clear your husband's name, his real name." The weeks after that Sunday night moved differently than ordinary time. I have noticed in 70 years of living that time has texture. Most of it is smooth days that pass without leaving much of a mark. Weeks that blur together into seasoned years that you can only distinguish from one another by the events you choose to remember. But certain periods are rough. They catch on everything. They move slowly and leave marks that last. And the weeks following the raid on Marengo Avenue were that kind of time. The FBI's investigation of Crown Meridian expanded rapidly in the days after the raid. Reyes called Samuel on the Tuesday morning with an update that he relayed to me that afternoon, sitting in my kitchen with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and his coffee going cold, the way mine always did. The cassette tapes had yielded audio. Not perfect audio. 43 years of magnetic decay had done its work, but the Quantico lab had recovered enough. Malcolm Crane's voice, identifiable by voice print analysis against archival recordings from a 1979 congressional hearing at which he had testified, could be heard directing the transfer of funds through a series of entities that matched exactly the shell company framework documented in Thomas's ledgers. Crane says, and I'm quoting from the transcript Reyes sent me, Samuel said, setting his glasses down on the table and reading from his phone, "The Ashford account transfers need to be complete before the end of the quarter. Make sure the documentation traces back to Jonathan. If it goes wrong, he takes the fall, not us." I sat with that sentence for a long moment. The fall. My father had been set up to take the fall for the very fraud he had discovered and tried to expose, and when the setup had not moved fast enough, Malcolm Crane had arranged something more permanent. I pressed my back teeth together and breathed through it and did not say anything for a while because there was nothing to say that the evidence had not already said more precisely. Evelyn, sitting across the table, reached out and put her hand flat on the table between us. Not touching me, just present just there, and that was enough. The formal investigation into the Bennett infrastructure case was reopened by the Department of Justice in October. I know this sounds simple, stated that way, and I want to be honest about the fact that it was not simple at all. It required Samuel filing a 17-page petition with supporting documentation. It required Reyes submitting a formal referral from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. It required 3 separate meetings between Samuel and a DOJ attorney named Christine Holloway, who was methodical and thorough and deeply skeptical in the way that good attorneys are skeptical, and who asked questions in their second meeting that made me sit in Samuel's waiting room for 40 minutes afterward, trying to remember how to breathe normally. What Christine Holloway's team found when they finally gained access to the original digital evidence from the 2008 case was the electronic signatures on the fraudulent wire transfers had been generated using a software exploit that had been patched by the financial industry in 2011. The exploit had first appeared in forensic literature in 2009. But Thomas Hale's ledgers documented the same signature forging methodology being used by Malcolm Crane's organization in transactions dating back to 1979, nearly 30 years before the software existed, which was impossible, which meant that the 2008 forgeries had been executed by people who had developed their own proprietary version of the exploit decades before the broader criminal community discovered it. The same people, the same methods, the same organization updated across 43 years. Christine Holloway called Samuel on a Thursday afternoon in November and said without preamble, "The prior allegations against your client cannot be sustained. We'll have the formal withdrawal paperwork ready by the end of the month." Samuel called me immediately after. I was in the garden turning the soil in Evelyn's rose beds because the physical labor of it was the only thing that had been helping me sleep. And I answered the phone with dirt on my gloves and stood there in the November afternoon light, listening to Samuel's voice and feeling something I had not felt in 15 years. Unlocked somewhere deep in my chest, not joy exactly. Not yet, but the specific sensation of a door opening that had been sealed so long you had stopped noticing the weight of it. I did not whoop or celebrate. I sat down on the garden bench and put my face in my hands and breathed, and after a few minutes, Evelyn came out of the house because she had been watching me through the kitchen window, and she sat down beside me and said, "Tell me." And I told her, and she pulled in a long breath that shook at the edges and let it out slowly and said, Thomas always knew this day would come. He built the whole thing for this day," I said. "Every ledger book, every cassette tape, the trust, the safe, the brick wall. He built it all for a day he was never certain he would live to see." Evelyn pressed her lips together hard. Then she said fiercely and clearly, "He saw it, maybe not in person, but he saw it." I did not argue with her. I chose to believe she was right. The DOJ issued its formal statement on the last Friday of November. The language was precise and institutional and carefully non-committal in the way that government language always is. But what it said, stripped to its essential meaning, was this: the allegations made against Walter R. Bennett in the Bennett infrastructure matter of 2008 were the product of third-party fraud, the perpetrators of which had now been identified as agents of the same criminal organization currently under federal indictment. All prior allegations were formally withdrawn. All associated records would be sealed. The department expressed in language that Samuel told me was unusually direct for a DOJ statement its recognition of the harm caused to Mr. Bennett and his family by the original proceedings. I read the statement 3 times at Samuel's kitchen table. Then I set it down and looked at Samuel and said, 15 years. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright in a way I had not seen before. He said, "I know, Walter, I know." "You couldn't have won it in 2008, I said, because it needed to be said and because I had spent 3 months deciding whether I meant it, and I did. Without Thomas's records, there was no winning it. The evidence against me was built on 40 years of practice. It was designed to be unbeatable." Samuel looked at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I should have told you about the forensic accountant. In 2008, I should have told you what she found." "Yes," I said. "You should have." We sat with that for a moment, not in anger, but in the honest acknowledgement of something true between 2 men who had known each other a long time. Then Samuel slid another document across the table. "There's something else you need to see." It was a letter from the trustee of the Delaware Trust Company that had managed Thomas's irrevocable trust for 43 years. When Thomas had established the trust in 1981, he had transferred the Ashford Holdings founder's shares into it, with Walter James, Ashford named as sole beneficiary. The trust had been maintained through 3 rounds of corporate restructuring, 2 mergers, and 1 acquisition, with the shares converting automatically at each transaction according to standard trust administration procedures. The current equivalent holding, adjusted for all conversions and stock splits, represented a significant ownership position in the successor corporation. "I don't want to run a company," I said immediately. "I know," Samuel said, "but you're going to have options, and I want you to think carefully about what you do with them." I thought about Jonathan Ashford, who had built something from a single engineering contract and watched it become large enough that powerful people killed him to control it. I thought about Thomas, who had spent 43 years in the shadow of that murder, maintaining a trust for a child. He had no obligation to protect, updating ledgers that he was never certain anyone would ever read. I thought about what it meant to leave something behind that stood. "I'll think about it," I said. Outside Samuel's office window, the December light was lying low and golden across Colorado Boulevard, the same light that had been lying across Marengo Avenue the morning this began. Evelyn was in the waiting room, reading a magazine, and when I came out she looked up and read my face the way she always did, and whatever she found there made her stand up immediately and come to me and take both of my hands in hers. "Well," she said. "It's over," I said. "The formal part anyway." She squeezed my hand so hard, my knuckles pressed together, and her eyes filled so fast it was like watching a glass overflow, and she said through all of it, "What do we do now?" I thought about the garden. I thought about the rose beds waiting for spring. I thought about the basement with its new lights and its empty safe and its fieldstone wall with the V crack that would always be there, a small permanent record of a night that had changed everything. "We go home," I said. "January in Pasadena is the season that the rest of the country does not believe exists. The tourists come in February for the roses, and the summer people come for the heat, and everybody else has some fixed idea of Southern California that involves either drought or sunshine or both simultaneously. But January is different. January in Pasadena is cool and clean, with a particular clarity to the light that makes the mountains look close enough to touch, and the air tastes faintly of something green and living. The jacaranda trees on Marengo Avenue had lost their leaves, and without the canopy, the morning light came straight down onto the front porch in long, flat panels that made the red brick look almost amber. I had been sitting on that porch every morning since we came home from Samuel's office in December, drinking my coffee while it was still hot, which was new. I had not done that in 15 years. I had not tasted hot coffee in 15 years because there had always been something pressing enough on my mind that the cup went cold before I remembered it. And now that thing was gone, and the coffee was hot, and the mountains were close, and I was trying to learn what ordinary mornings felt like when they were not lying to me. It was harder than I expected. Ordinary is a skill. You have to practice it. Samuel came by on a Tuesday morning in the second week of January with a leather folder and 2 cups of coffee from the place on Fair Oaks that he knew I liked. And we sat at the kitchen table while Evelyn was at her garden club and went through the trust documents together for the 3rd time. The Delaware trustee had provided a full accounting of the Ashford Holdings shares and their current equivalent value, adjusted for every conversion and split across 43 years of corporate evolution. The number on the page was larger than I had allowed myself to contemplate. "You have several options," Samuel said, spreading the documents across the table with the systematic care of a man who has organized his thoughts before arriving. "You could take a seat on the successor corporation's board. You have enough shares to demand one, and frankly, after what their predecessors did to your father, there is a certain justice argument to be made for being in the room." He paused. "You could liquidate the position entirely, which would be the cleanest financial outcome, but would mean walking away from any ongoing role." He paused again. "Or you could do something else with it." I looked at the number on the page. I thought about Jonathan Ashford sitting in his office in Los Angeles in 1980, discovering what Malcolm Crane was doing and spending 8 months building a case file instead of running. I thought about what it meant to be the kind of man who builds things rather than the kind who takes them. I thought about Thomas, who had spent 43 years maintaining a trust he was never certain would matter, updating ledgers that might never be read, replacing a brick in a basement wall, and telling a child to remember the V crack for the most desperate of times. Both of them had built things that stood. I wanted to do the same. "I want to establish a foundation," I said, "in my father's name, Jonathan Ashford Foundation." I had been thinking about the name for 3 weeks, and it felt right when I said it out loud. Solid like good load-bearing concrete. "The primary purpose will be financial restitution for victims of Crown Meridian's operations. Reyes told me there are investors across 4 states who lost money to their schemes over the past 2 decades. People who trusted a fund that was built on fraud and lost retirement savings, college funds, everything." I looked at Samuel. "I want to find them and pay them back." Samuel's pen had stopped moving. He was looking at me over his reading glasses with an expression I could not immediately identify. And then I recognized it. It was the same expression he had worn in the courtroom in 2008 when the judge read the dismissal. The expression of a man who has been fighting for something and has suddenly, unexpectedly found himself on the right side of a result. "That's going to take years," he said, "and a significant portion of the value." "I know. You're 70 years old." "I'm aware of that too." "Walter," he set his pen down, "you could retire. You have earned in every conceivable sense of the word the right to simply stop." "I know I have," I said, "but my father didn't get to choose how his story ended. Thomas spent his whole life in the shadow of someone else's crime. I have the chance to end this thing the right way, to use what they took from my family to repair what they took from other people." I looked at him steadily. "That's not obligation, Samuel. That's choice. There's a difference." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and said, "I'll start drafting the foundation documents this week." The following Saturday, I flew to New York. I told Evelyn I was going to meet with the Delaware trustee in person, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I needed to do something I had been avoiding for 15 years, and I needed to do it alone before the foundation was established, and the legal machinery started turning, and the story became something public and documented and permanent. I needed to say goodbye to Bennett Infrastructure. The building on 6th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, where I had built my company across 12 years, still stood exactly as I remembered it. The same glass and steel facade, the same revolving door, the same lobby with the high ceilings and the marble floors that I had chosen myself, because I believed when I was 40 years old and building something from nothing that the entrance to a place tells you everything about the people who work there. The name above the door was different now. The company that Crown Meridian had sold the assets to had rebranded twice in 15 years, and the current name meant nothing to me. I stood on the sidewalk across 6th Avenue in my overcoat and looked at that building for a long time. People moved around me on the sidewalk, the particular dense, purposeful movement of Manhattan in January. Everybody going somewhere at speed. Nobody with time to notice a 70-year-old man standing still in the middle of all of it. I thought about the 12 years I had spent in that building, the contracts won and the contracts lost, the engineers and project managers who had trusted me with their careers and whom I had trusted with my company's reputation. The pride I had felt and the responsibility and the specific exhaustion of being the person that everyone looked to when something went wrong. I had loved that exhaustion. I had not known how much until it was taken from me. I thought about the morning in 2008 when I had stood in a conference room on the 14th floor and listened to the board vote to suspend me, pending investigation, and the way the room had gone very quiet after the vote, and the way nobody had met my eyes as I walked out. I let myself feel all of it. The loss, the humiliation, the 15 years of living under a cloud that was not mine. I stood on 6th Avenue and let it move through me like weather cold and necessary and real. Then I straightened my coat. I turned away from the building. I walked to the corner and hailed a cab to the Delaware trustee's office, and I did not look back. On the flight home, somewhere over Nevada in the dark, Evelyn called to ask how the meeting had gone. "Good," I said. "It went well." "And the other thing?" she asked because she always knew. I looked out the window at the darkness below, at the occasional cluster of lights that meant a town or a highway, or a life being lived at ground level far beneath me. "Done," I said. "It's done." She was quiet for a moment, then softly, "Come home, Walter." "I'm on my way," I said. February in Pasadena arrived without ceremony, slipping in behind January's cold clarity like a quiet afterthought. The jacaranda trees were still bare. The rose beds Evelyn had been tending since October were showing the first cautious green at the tips of the canes, small and tentative the way hope tends to arrive sideways in the margins when you are not quite looking for it. I was in the kitchen making coffee on a Thursday morning when the phone rang. Evelyn was at the table with her crossword puzzle glasses pushed up on her forehead, pencil tapping against her lower lip, the way it always did when she was stuck on a clue. She glanced at the phone screen. Her hand stopped moving. The pencil went still. I turned from the counter and saw her face. The screen read, "Incoming call, Brandon Cole, Los Angeles County Jail." Under California, law inmates awaiting trial are permitted a limited number of monitored calls to approved contacts. Brandon had apparently put Evelyn's number on his list. This was the first time he had used it. We had known this call would come eventually. We had not talked about what to do when it did. Evelyn looked at the phone. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were doing the thing they sometimes did when she was carrying more than she had words for her. Very still, very clear, the kind of eyes that have already made a decision and are simply waiting for the rest of the person to catch up. "You don't have to answer it," I said. "I know," she said. The phone rang a second time, a third. She picked it up. I stayed at the counter with my coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the rose beds while she talked. I could hear Brandon's voice faintly through the speaker. Not the words, just the register, the particular quality of a voice that is trying to sound steady and not quite managing it. I could hear Evelyn's responses more clearly, short sentences, careful ones, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this conversation in her head many times and had decided in advance exactly how much of herself she was willing to give. "I know," she said, and then, I understand. And then after a long pause that I felt across the room, I can't answer that yet, Brandon. The call lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, she set the phone face down on the table and sat with both hands flat on the crossword puzzle, looking at nothing in particular. I brought her coffee to the table and sat across from her. She did not reach for it immediately. He wanted to know if I would come to the sentencing, she said finally. Her voice was even measured, the voice she used when the thing she was describing had happened to someone else. He said he needed to see a face he recognized when the judge read the verdict. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would make this easier, and I had learned over 23 years of marriage that some silences are not empty. They are full of everything that does not need to be spoken. I told him I didn't know yet, Evelyn said. She picked up the coffee mug with both hands the way she did when she needed something solid to hold. Which is true, I genuinely don't know. That's a fair answer, I said. She looked at me over the rim of the mug. Is it, or is it just the answer that lets me avoid deciding for another month? Maybe both, I said. Those aren't always different things. She set the mug down, picked up her pencil, looked at the crossword puzzle for a long moment without seeing it. He sounded smaller, she said quietly. His voice, it sounded like it had less space around it. She pressed her lips together. I know what that place does to people. I know what waiting does to people. She shook her head very slightly. I just don't know yet if knowing that changes anything. You don't have to decide today, I said. No, she said, I don't. She found the clue she had been stuck on and filled in the answer. 6 letters, something I could not read from across the table. The pencil moved with its usual certainty, as if the word had been there all along and only needed her to be ready to see it. Outside, a mockingbird landed in the bare jacaranda tree and began its catalog of borrowed songs. The rosebeds caught the February morning light. The coffee was hot. I thought about Brandon's voice as Evelyn had described it, smaller, less space around it, and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but lived somewhere in the territory between them, the territory where you love someone and cannot save them from the consequences of their own choices, and the loving and the not saving have to exist in the same place at the same time. 3 weeks later, Evelyn put on her dark blue dress and came downstairs without a word. She picked up her handbag and looked at me and said, "Let's go." I did not ask her why she had decided. I had learned that too over 23 years. Some decisions explain themselves by the fact of being made. The federal courthouse in Los Angeles smelled like every courthouse I had ever been, in floor wax and recycled air, and the particular institutional quiet of a building designed to make human beings feel small against the weight of the law. Evelyn and I arrived 40 minutes early. She wore the dark blue dress she saved for serious occasions, and she sat very straight in the gallery bench with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the front of the courtroom, with the focused stillness of a woman who has decided exactly how much of herself she is willing to spend today and is conserving the rest. I sat beside her and did not try to fill the space between us with words because there were no words adequate to what we were both doing here, and we had learned over 23 years of marriage to know the difference between a silence that needed breaking and one that needed keeping. Brandon was already at the defense table when we came in. He had lost weight. His suit was the same dark charcoal he had always worn to important meetings, but it fit differently now, looser across the shoulders, slightly wrong in the way that clothes go wrong, when the body inside them has been diminished by something the tailor could not have anticipated. His hair was shorter than I remembered. He was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and when he heard us come in, he turned and looked at us. And the expression on his face was something I did not have a name for, too complicated for guilt, too broken for defiance, too old for the 42-year-old face wearing it. He held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he looked at his mother. Evelyn did not look away from him. She held his gaze with her chin up and her eyes full and her hands absolutely still in her lap. And something passed between them that I wasn't meant to be part of and did not try to interpret. Then she looked back at the front of the courtroom, and Brandon turned back to the defense table, and the proceeding began. Melissa was absent. Her cooperation agreement had resulted in a separate sentencing scheduled for the following month, and the U.S. attorney had determined that her presence today would complicate the proceedings. I was grateful for that. I had enough to carry today without also having to sit in the same room as the woman who had walked into my house with a fuel container in her tote bag. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Patricia Okafor, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the measured authority of someone who had been making consequential decisions for a long time and had stopped finding them dramatic. She read the charges methodically: false imprisonment of an elder, abuse with sentencing enhancement, federal mortgage fraud, forgery conspiracy to commit financial fraud. She summarized the cooperation agreement's terms and the prosecution's sentencing recommendation. Brandon was allowed to speak before sentencing. He stood up from the table slowly, the way people stand when their legs are not entirely reliable, and turned to face not the judge, but us, Evelyn and me, in the third row of the gallery, and he said, "I didn't know who they were. I want you to know that. I didn't know Crown Meridian was what it was, and I didn't know what was in the basement, and I didn't know any of the history." His voice broke on the last word, and he steadied it with visible effort, pressing his lips together and breathing through it the way I had seen him do since he was 9 years old, trying not to cry in front of people. "But I knew what I was doing to you. I knew you were down there. I drove away." He looked at his mother. "Mom, I drove away." Evelyn's chin trembled so hard I could see it from 3 feet away. Her hands, which had been so perfectly still all morning, knotted together in her lap until her knuckles went white. She did not speak. She pressed her lips together and held his gaze and let the tears come down her face without wiping them, as if wiping them would be a form of concession she was not prepared to make. I stood up. My knees hurt and my back hurt, and I was 70 years old, and I had not slept well in 6 months, and I stood up in the federal courthouse in Los Angeles and looked at the young man I had taught to ride a bicycle and drive a car and sign his first lease, and I said, "You may not have known who they were, Brandon, but you're right. You knew what you were doing to us. I hope 4 years gives you enough time to understand the difference between those two things." He nodded, once slowly. A tear ran down the left side of his face and fell from his jaw onto the collar of his suit jacket. Judge Okafor sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison with eligibility for supervised release after 30 months, contingent on continued cooperation with the ongoing Crown Meridian prosecution. When the marshal let him out, Brandon looked back one more time, not at me, at Evelyn. She raised her right hand, not quite a wave, something smaller and more private than a wave, a gesture that seemed to mean, "I see you. I cannot save you from this. But I see you." He was gone. Evelyn stood up from the bench and took my arm, and we walked out of the courthouse together, into the March afternoon, into the pale winter sun that did not know or care what had just happened inside. And she said nothing for a long time, and then she said, "I raised a son who chose himself over his family. That is not something you forgive, Walter. It is something you learn to carry." "I know," I said. "I will carry it," she said. "But I will not let it be the heaviest thing I carry." She took my hand and held on, and we walked to the car, and I drove us home to Marengo Avenue, and neither of us said anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying today. 3 weeks after the sentencing on a Saturday morning, when Evelyn had gone to her garden club and the house was quiet in the way it only gets when you are the sole person left inside it, I went to the basement, not for any practical reason. The electrician had already installed the new lights in October. The foundation wall had been inspected and cleared. The FBI had taken everything worth taking: the safe, the ledgers, the cassette tapes, the USB drive, and what remained was simply a room. Ordinary fieldstone and concrete, and the faint smell of earth that never entirely goes away, no matter how many lights you install. I went because I had not yet allowed myself to go for this reason, and I understood, standing at the top of the stairs with my hand on the doorframe, that it was time. I carried 2 things. The photograph of Jonathan and Catherine Ashford, returned to me by Agent Reyes after the evidence processing concluded, worn at the corners from being handled too many times in a single night. And Thomas's letter, which I had asked Reyes to copy before the original went into evidence and which had lived in the breast pocket of my wool jacket for 4 months without my being ready to fully look at it again. The basement looked different with proper lighting. The same walls, the same floor, the same low ceiling, but evenly lit. Now it looked less like a vault and more like what it actually was. A room that happened to contain the hinge point of several lives. The wooden shelf Thomas had built beside the hiding place was still there. Rough-cut wood hand-fitted to the corner of the wall. The FBI had taken everything from the shelf except the shelf itself, because it was just a shelf, and shelves do not qualify as evidence. I set the photograph on it, Jonathan Ashford looked back at me from 1981 with his arm around his wife and his laugh still alive in the faded colors, and I stood there looking at the man whose eyes were my eyes and whose shoulders were my shoulders, and felt something I did not have a precise name for. Not grief exactly, not joy exactly, but the particular sensation of a door opening onto a room you did not know existed, and finding it full of things that were always yours. I had spent 43 years not knowing these people. I had some number of years remaining to learn who they had been. I unfolded Thomas's letter. I had read it twice in the dark on that Sunday night in September, with my hands shaking and Evelyn beside me. I had not read it since. I had carried it the way you carry something you are not ready to put down, but not yet ready to fully face. I read it now. All of it, standing in the properly lit basement with my parents' photograph on the shelf and 43 years of answered questions behind me. Thomas wrote that the fear had faded eventually, replaced by something more sustainable, the daily practice of simply doing the next right thing. Feeding the child, checking the homework, showing up. He wrote, "I did not give birth to you, but I gave you my whole life. I want you to know that I never once considered it a sacrifice. You were the best thing I ever did, Walter. Not because of who you were born to, because of who you became." My throat closed so hard, I had to tip my head back and breathe through it. And for a moment, the LED lights on the ceiling became a blur of white through the water in my eyes. And I let it happen because there was no one here to hold it together for. I had not cried in September. I had been too necessary. I had held Evelyn while she cried and kept my own eyes dry and done what needed doing, and afterward I had simply not found the moment, or had not let myself find it, which is a different thing. I found it now. I let myself grieve Thomas Hale the way he deserved fully, without management, without an audience. It did not last long. It moved through me, and I breathed through it, and when it was done, I folded the letter carefully along its original creases and looked at the photograph of Jonathan Ashford, and felt something settle in my chest that had not been settled in a very long time, perhaps ever. I heard Evelyn's car in the driveway. The garden club must have ended early. Her footsteps crossed the kitchen floor above me and stopped. She had noticed the open basement door, a pause, then her feet on the stairs, careful and deliberate. She appeared at the bottom with a basket of garden cuttings over one arm and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she took in the photograph on the shelf and the letter in my hands and my face, which I made no effort to compose, and she set the basket down and came across the room without a word. She stood beside me and looked at the photograph for a long moment. "She has kind eyes," she said. "Your mother." "She does," I said. "You have her mouth." Evelyn reached up and touched the corner of my mouth with one finger gently, the way you touch something you want to memorize. That little upturn at the left corner. "I always thought that was just you." "I always thought so too," I said. She lowered her hand and took mine and held it, and we stood together looking at the photograph of two people who had not been given enough time in a basement that had kept their story safe for 43 years, in a house on Marengo Avenue that still stood, because one quiet, careful man had spent his whole life making sure it did. "Thomas would have liked April," Evelyn said finally. "He always complained about the cold." A sound came out of me that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but contained both something from the specific place where grief and gratitude live so close together you cannot always tell them apart. "Yes," I said, "he would have." Above us through the small basement window, jacaranda blossoms were drifting across the afternoon in purple clouds landing on the brick and the oak roots and the ordinary ground of Marengo Avenue, beautiful and temporary and entirely real. Some mornings I sit on this porch and I think about all the things I did not know. I did not know for 70 years that the man who checked my homework and resoled my shoes and drove me to school in a used Buick without ever complaining was not my father by blood, but was my father by everything that actually matters. I did not know the quiet life he built for us was not the life he had planned, but the life he had chosen deliberately and at great personal cost to keep me alive long enough to find out who I really was. I did not know that the instincts that built Bennett infrastructure, the feel for load-bearing structures, the understanding of how things fail and how to build them, so they do not came from a man I never got to meet. A man who looked like me and laughed like me and believed as I have always believed that the work you do in the world is a form of testimony about the kind of person you are. I know these things now. The coffee in my hand is hot. I have been drinking it hot every morning since September. That sounds like a small thing. It is in fact a large one. It means the weight I carried for 15 years, the weight of a crime I did not commit, a name I was given to survive, a secret 3 generations paid for, has finally been set down. I did not realize how much of my body had been organized around carrying it until the morning. I noticed I had finished an entire cup before it went cold, and I sat very still for a moment on this porch and understood that something fundamental had shifted. I am learning that peace, like ordinary mornings, is a skill you have to practice. The Jonathan Ashford Foundation filed its articles of incorporation in January. Samuel handled the paperwork with the same methodical care he brings to everything. And on the morning the state of California confirmed the filing, he called me and read the official language aloud over the phone in his careful attorney's voice. And when he finished, there was a silence between us that was not awkward but full. The silence of 2 men who had been fighting the same war for a long time and had finally reached a day worth marking. The first letters went out to Crown Meridian's identified victims in February. Reyes had provided the list, 47 individuals and families across 4 states who had lost retirement savings college funds, and in 3 cases everything they had, to a fund built on fraud that stretched back further than any of them had known. I read every name on that list. I did not do it quickly. I sat at the kitchen table with Evelyn's hand flat on the table beside mine, and I read each name and let it mean something, because these were not figures on a balance sheet. They were people who had trusted the wrong institution the same way my father had trusted the wrong vice president, and they deserved to have someone sit with the weight of what that cost them before writing a check. We have heard back from 19 of the 47 so far. Some of the letters are formal and brief. Some of them are not. A woman in Phoenix named Dorothy Marsh wrote 3 pages by hand, and her handwriting shook in the places where she described what losing her husband's retirement had done to her family. And I read it twice and then set it face down on the desk and walked out to the garden and stood there for a while, not doing anything in particular. Evelyn came out and stood beside me and did not ask what was wrong because she had already read the letter herself. We are going to be doing this for years. I am 70 years old, and I intend to spend those years doing exactly this. Thomas used to say that God does not waste suffering. I did not believe him in 2008 when I was losing everything. I believe him now. I look at what that suffering produced: the years of careful preparation, the decision to hold on to this house the night in the basement when everything buried for 69 years finally came into the light, and I can see the shape of something I could not see while I was inside it. God works in the long term. The accounting, when it finally comes, is precise. There is a man named Malcolm Crane who built a career on destroying other people's work and lives. In the end, his organization was not undone by investigators or luck. It was undone by a quiet accountant who loved a child that was not his own and spent his whole life keeping the truth alive. 1 ledger book at a time, 1 brick carefully replaced in a basement wall at a time. It mattered. God knows it mattered. Evelyn comes out now with her coffee and her crossword puzzle and sits beside me the way she has for 23 years. The jacaranda is blooming overhead. The mountains are close. The coffee is hot. My name is Walter. The last name has a longer story. One that began in Los Angeles in 1955 and ended, or perhaps began again, in a basement on Marengo Avenue on a Sunday night in September. But the first name, the name Thomas, kept the name he wrote on my school forms and my birthday cakes. That name was always mine. He made sure of it. Whatever you were carrying tonight, whatever wall you were standing in front of and cannot see past, the truth has a way of surviving. It gets buried, but it does not disappear. And when it finally comes into the light, it brings something no deception can manufacture. It brings the chance to know fully and finally who you are. If this story reached your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Leave a comment, tell me what you would have done in my place. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and don't let the coffee go cold. Looking back at this family story, I made mistakes I cannot undo. I spent 70 years carrying a name that wasn't mine and a silence that nearly cost me everything. So, let me say this plainly, the way I wish someone had said it to me. Don't wait for a crisis to tell the people you love the truth. Don't let pride or fear become the wall between you and the life you were meant to live. Family betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it walks through your front door, wearing a familiar face and calling you dad. I learned that the hardest way possible. And I learned something else. That family story doesn't end with the betrayal. It ends with what you choose to do after. My personal belief after everything trust is not weakness. Rebuilding after it's broken is not failure. The willingness to stand up in your own basement at 70 years old and refuse to surrender, that is the only inheritance worth passing down. God placed the truth behind that wall at exactly the right moment, not a day too soon, not a day too late. If this family betrayal resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Leave a comment telling me what would you have done in my place. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you sincerely for staying with me until the very end of this family story. It means more than you know. A gentle note: some stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and life lessons. If that's not the content for you, we completely respect your choice to find what speaks to your heart elsewhere.